evening, comrades, colleagues, Democrats, fellow citizens, wherever you are. And welcome to our session, of course, entitled Market Dynamism and Not Delivering a People's Vaccine. How should we intervene? And once again, I would like to congratulate C20 Organizing Committee, the Secretariat, for bringing all of us together to exchange policy and political views on global issues that are affecting humanity. And of course, indeed, we demand and deserve a people's vaccine, not a profit vaccine for that matter. And this will enable the world to achieve universal health coverage and save lives for all across the world. Certainly, indeed, we can't depend on health systems that are dependent on affordability. We need to unite and achieve global health solidarity as activists, as ordinary people, as government leaders, as academics, and as thinkers. Certainly, to my experience, platforms such as the C20 do have a potential to deliver and achieve significant public policy gains at a global level, at a regional level, at a multilateral level. But this can only happen when we engage and enter into dialogue that brings about changes and commitments and practical commitments for that matter. Indeed, at this stage, what we need is a commitment from political leaders, from business leaders, that would indeed give us a public policy direction that would help us to tackle the coronavirus crisis and other social ills such as inequality, etc., etc. Again, I would like to thank the C20 Organizing Committee, the staff, the Secretariat, and advisors for bringing all of us together. Welcome to this session. We will spend 1.5 hours together with our panel of esteemed scholars, activists for good cause, researchers. They come in their diversity. As you would have perhaps appreciated, we do have a hashtag C20. Please do tweet and share, retweet the conversation, which is live today. Without any further ado, it is my privilege to introduce our panel of speakers today, starting with Mr. Elhad Saeed, who is the co-chair of the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board. We would also have Dr. Moka Kamal Yan, who is the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, and Ms. Kate Elder, Senior Vaccines Policy Advisor at MSF, and Dr. Ellen Hone, Director for Medicine, Law and Policy, and then of course, Professor Brooke Baker, who is a policy analyst, also serving at Health Global Access Project. It's over to you. The floor is yours, Mr. Asai.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody from Dakar. And very pleased to join fellow panelists, to discuss this very important topic. Like rightly said, Chair, I have the honor, together with Dr. Brundtland, to co-chair the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, which is an independent body that is monitoring, the level of preparedness, in terms of pandemics and public health threat. But beyond preparedness, also the capacity to respond. So last year in September, around the same time, we produced our first report with a sobering title, "A World at Risk," because we realized that really the world was not prepared for any shock of hazard of a scale of magnitude for what we're experiencing today, and even worse if it was a highly infectious respiratory infection. We called for action, and those actions were centered around leadership, centered around solidarity and having a multilateral platform for a better response. We called also for citizens, to hold the governments and elites responsible and responsive, and to deliver on the promises, they made. And we call also on the centrality of science to guide what we have to do. Well, a year later, we started seeing what we feared. And that is really one of the worst things that can happen to you, in your work. If you predict a catastrophic situation, to happen, and then you see it happening. And then we wonder, why, when we had all the knowledge and the tools to analyze something was happening, why didn't we, have the tools and the mechanisms and the leadership and all what it takes to prevent it from happening? Well, this year we published our second report with another sobering title, which is called A World in Disorder. Because that is in that disorder that explains what we are experiencing today. So there are a number of issues that come throughout those analyses. One, leadership is important. And there is a leadership broke down, unfortunately. Two, we see that there are at least three arms that always are cohabitating, and they do not always support each other: science, politics, and activism. Leadership of politics should be part of the solution, and many times they are also part of a problem. So activism is what citizens have to mobilize around to hold leaders accountable. And it cannot be only left in the hands of politicians and others not to deliver on the promises that they made. Science should guide what we do, but unfortunately amplified by social media, a lot of fake news circulating around, and even questioning the fundamentals of the science that are about to guide us. When we talk about solidarity and compassion, we never talked about charity. We talk about that all of us, being safe. So the motto that we are hearing now, none of us is safe until we all are, is really not a slogan. It is a reality. It is a reality that we are experiencing. In a pandemic, it makes absolutely no sense. Even if a country was able to have 100% of your population covered and vaccinated, while in your neighboring countries, you have zero. You are better off maybe if you have 50% of your population and 50%, in the neighboring countries, that will protect us all. It is just a scientific reality that will protecting us all. So in a world of disorder, we have also to call again, for leadership. We have to call again for citizens. And this time, we are putting a particular emphasis on citizens and the citizenship, around. That is the reason why we are so pleased, to be joining this initiative of C20, because we see that civil society organizations are building that branch of activism and citizenship that is required, so that we have a people's vaccine. And I really like very much that we put people first. It's people's vaccine. It's not about technology. It is not about economics. It's not about profit. It's not about trade. It is about people. People at the center of what we do for analysis. People, that matters. That is uniting us, all of us, around what matters most, which is really the humanity, that we all have to care for. And that is in that spirit that we also support, many of the other calls that were made. Now, it is heartening to see that 156 countries have joined, the COVAX facility, which is very good. We are seeing on the other end, a lot of threats, that we really have to be aware of. What is in a very nice word called nationalism, vaccine nationalism and treatment nationalism. Frankly, I don't see anything nationalistic about it. It is just a certain level of egoism and lack of solidarity, forgetting again that we are not safe if we not all are. And I think we need also to, make sure that the international platforms, that exist work better, and where they do not work better, and there is a huge gap. We need also all of us to work together to see that new mechanisms are being created, so that we do not do just business as usual or go back to what we call, the normal, because as somebody said, the normal was not working. So we have to really reinvent, something. It is now a co-creation and a partnership that we called for, and we stand ready to continue to engage with you and to work with you, and also to have a fruitful conversation looking ahead, how we can support each other on that path of solidarity, compassion, and care. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Over back to you.
Floor is yours, Kate.
Great. And thank you very much as well to the organizers of C20, and lovely to be on this panel with all of you, many friends, old and new. Just continue on with what Elliot was just saying, in terms of needing a people's vaccine, I think we can look at the situation right now where there is concern about people globally, equitably being able to access this vaccine. And while this situation may seem new to us, because we've never been in a global pandemic before, we've never all been simultaneously, or at least not of recent memory, simultaneously waiting for the advent of a new vaccine and hoping that everybody has it at the same time. What I want to say is that while the situation may be new, the dynamics around the situation and vaccine access are certainly not new. Those of us that have worked in the access to medicines community for a long time have seen many of these same issues preventing people from getting access, whether it's drugs or diagnostics or vaccines. I've worked in vaccination specifically for the past 15 years. And what we're seeing right now with COVID, we've seen with HPV vaccines, we've seen with pneumococcal conjugate vaccines, where the people who need them, sometimes the people that are affected most by the disease, if we're talking about HPV, for example, where in sub-Saharan Africa, the vast majority of cervical cancer illness and death is among women in that region, but HPV vaccine is not readily available there. There's limited supply. Manufacturers say that they just don't have the supply for those populations, and the prices are exorbitantly high, preventing people from accessing those vaccines. So while this situation with COVID has garnered all of the appropriate attention because we're in this global pandemic together, and really highlighted some of the concerns around who is going to get these future vaccines, the situation is just not new. So I just want to say we've been in this situation for many years to come. But in the advent of COVID, there have been obviously significant measures that have been taken to try and organize globally to counter some of the vaccine nationalism and to think more holistically as a global community than we've ever seen before. We've seen a specific initiative run by Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, called the COVAX facility. The COVAX facility aiming to provide a global platform where any country of the world can join together and procure vaccine through that mechanism. So in its spirit, a very admirable idea, and also a mechanism to try and hedge against this nationalism and what we've seen in a number of high-income countries where they've been striking bilateral deals and tied up future volumes, preventing the rest of the world from being able to access them. But then when we start to look at, where the rubber hits the road, what are the limitations of this current mechanism? And unfortunately, it does seem to be falling prey to some of the global political dynamics that we see other global health initiatives fall prey to. For example, the influence of high-income countries in the COVAX facility has been exorbitant, whereby some of the initial premises of equity, whereby the poorest countries of the world will be able to access vaccines at the same time and in the same volumes as higher-income, wealthy countries, has been sort of compromised on due to high-income countries pushing and influencing the COVAX facility. We now see a departure from some of the initial tenets of equity. For example, where the 92 poorest countries of the world will only be able to access this vaccine based upon donor financing. And if we don't reach certain financial goals, then they're at risk of not having vaccine at the same time, where the high-income countries, self-financing countries, have the option to choose if they procure vaccine for certain volumes, whereas the poorest countries of the world are being told that they will just get certain volumes. So I think some of the global dynamics and pressures are coming to bear in light of developing this global mechanism, the COVAX facility. And maybe we should think about, well, why is that? I mean, the COVAX facility is being led by Gavi, which is a public-private partnership, a Swiss-based foundation. It's not actually in a multilateral body. And if we're talking about multilateralism and where governments really get to say, we need to think about using those instruments for these global solutions. And what we've seen is the rise of public-private partnerships generally, which are not multilateral institutions, institutions, which have a very deliberate concentration of power in a few hands. And ultimately that leads to these sorts of policies that can exclude people because governments don't all come with an equal voice. So really, what do we need for a people's vaccine? Well, we need to, of course, improve upon making the pie as big as possible. I know other colleagues are going to talk about this, but if the COVAX facility genuinely wanted to make as many volumes as possible for as many people around the world, what it would have been doing is mandating specific policies within its architecture to ensure that we're making the pie as big as possible. The COVAX facility is an intervention at a certain period of time. It is trying to raise as much money as possible and see what it can negotiate with industry, but it's not addressing some of the root systemic issues that hinder access, issues around intellectual property, which colleagues will talk about, issues around expanding manufacturing capacity. Ultimately, right now, this is not a people's vaccine. These future vaccines remain proprietary vaccines. So if the COVAX facility wants to genuinely do that, it should be looking to instill policies and conditionalities upon manufacturers that aim to participate in it. It should be promoting transparency. It should be countering tiered pricing, a commercial strategy of industry to try and extract as much money as possible from different purchasers. What we've seen, of course, is an imperfect mechanism be developed because it has fallen prey to some political dynamics and had to advance itself really at the behest of some high-income countries that sort of want to have their cake and eat it too. So I think if we're talking about a people's vaccine, we have to make sure it's not proprietary, and we have to make sure that we have to address some of the systemic issues that have hindered access, not only right now during COVID, but many years past in many other medicines and many other vaccines. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate, for your opening remarks. Very much appreciated. Dr. Mocha, are you ready now?
Yeah, so basically, I'm going to do something different after this excellent words from Kate. I'm going to do some cooking because I love cooking. So Kate mentioned a pie. The supply we have at the moment is this. It's a small pie with the big, powerful taking the big chunks of the pie and leaving tiny bit for the rest of us. How is that happening? This is just to illustrate where the doses have gone so far. These are the vaccines that are potentially going to be effective and safe. We don't know, of course, but this potentially the case. Here is what the rich countries basically, I only here focused on the US, UK, EU, and a little bit of Japan, because they really had the lion's share of the doses. So with these 4 blocks, they have secured over 4 billion doses of most of the vaccines. You could see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, just count how many vaccines that they secured. Of course, we know that not all these vaccines are going to be effective. Now, WHO says that we can't vaccinate everybody, so we'll start with health workers, and then we go with the other at-risk groups to reach 20% of your population. So I calculated 20% of each population and marked it against these vaccines that the number of doses they bought. And the picture is just talking. You don't have to look at the figures. The green thing is the secured doses, and the blue thing, the blue bar is the population. The rich countries have secured, can they help while I'm talking, please? They have secured enormous amount of doses for their population. So, for example, let's talk about the total of the US, UK, and the EU. They secured, and Japan, over 4 billion doses for, if you go for the 20% of the population, 4 billion doses for 169 million people. We do realize that you're not going to get the 4 billion because not all the vaccines are going to be effective and safe, but it gives an idea of the fact that they secured, if this vaccine doesn't work, the other one would work. If 5 vaccines didn't work, maybe 3 will work, and they will have not enough and more for their 20%. We've got the UK saying that they will vaccinate 50% of the population. They're just quite clear about that. They said our at-risk group are 50% of the population, and that's that. Just accept it. And as Kate said, this is an old story. It's not just the COVID vaccine that is problematic. We have a history of another pandemic, another epidemic. In 2009, the swine flu vaccine was hoarded by rich countries, and there was hardly anything left in the market for developing countries to buy. I think the virus had mercy on us, so it kind of came and left without needing to go. But actually, by the time the vaccine could be bought for developing countries, the virus is gone. But this is not the case now. With COVID, we've already had problems with hoarding. We've got the PPE, the personal protective equipment for health workers. Developing countries are struggling to get any. The tests, it's the same thing. There's limited supply for developing countries. So there's a combination of hoarding and limited supply. In terms of therapeutics, medicines to treat COVID, the remdesivir that Gilead produces, the US just decided to have all the production until September, and there is shortage in Europe, let alone in developing countries. There's shortage in Europe. Of course, developing countries, there's some license to produce in Bangladesh and India and other countries. But of course, Europe cannot import generics, God forbid. So they stuck with shortage. But also the new treatment, I don't know if you're following President Trump's illness and the new treatment that he has been given. If that treatment proves effective, there is also a shortage because it's hoarded. So when we say, do we leave it to the market? We've got a number of problems in relation to supply if you leave things to the market to solve. One thing is there's not enough production, and I'm sorry you can't see the small slide, it's a small pizza. There's not enough production. There's not one company able to produce for everybody under the sun. This is just not possible. And if you look at, for example, the measles vaccine, you know, it's easy. UNICEF can say this year we'll have, I don't know, 1 million kids who will be 1 year old and want measles. So you know it's 1 million. You know that already. And also there's a number of companies producing measles vaccine. So sometimes there's shortage, but there's not a huge shortage like what we would face now. With this, we want first 20% of the whole planet population, and then we want everybody in the whole planet. So who can make this? So you have to really ensure that there is maximization of all potential suppliers. Anybody who can actually make the vaccine safely should be encouraged to do that so that we have the supply. You leave it to the market, you have limited supply. We will always have shortage. The other thing is by leaving it in the market, you allow the hoarding. In fact, you encourage the hoarding because those who have money can secure more doses, just like what's happening now. The third problem with leaving it to the market, that actually we're leaving the business as usual situation where pharmaceutical companies control the supply and the price. And this is a pandemic, for God's sake. This is not a disease that's affecting 5 people. This is a pandemic that's affecting everybody. And we still cannot, you know, world leaders or whoever makes decisions cannot touch the holy cow of the pharmaceutical companies. No, they cannot challenge the monopoly of pharma on technology and on intellectual property. So there is monopoly on both. Of course, we need licensed technology. We need the intellectual property to be licensed to other producers, but we need technology transfer to these other producers. And still, COVAX, Gavi, CEPI, this coalition that fund research, Gates Foundation, you name it, pharmaceutical companies, they all say and insist that intellectual property has nothing to do with vaccine, or vaccines have nothing to do with intellectual property. I have no idea how they say that, but they say it. So they're happy to leave the control of supply and price in hands of pharma, and they just negotiate whatever goodwill that pharma can give. So AstraZeneca negotiated a reasonable deal because Oxford insisted on a reasonable deal. Now, another company in the US that might produce a better vaccine is just not interested. Why should they? If they're making profit in northern markets, why should they be interested in other markets except for PR? So anyway, so leaving the monopoly control in the hands of pharma. So the current initiatives, as Kate said, COVAX and others, holding promise as a mechanism to ensure supply, big supply and fair share, but they maintain business as usual. And I think the answer is really a big pizza, which is basically biggest production possible, and fair share. Everybody takes allocation according to their population need, not their capacity to pay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor, for your thoughts and insights. Certainly does sound like we are still very far from really achieving equality based on your reflections, but we'll come back to that. May I now invite Dr. Elaine to address us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and first of all to the C20 organizers, thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this event. It's really wonderful to see all of them, and I hope there are many listening. So, of course, an effective vaccine available to all as rapidly as possible is what we all want and what we need to break the stronghold of this pandemic, and indeed that should be a people's vaccine. In fact, no one is counting on market dynamics to deliver the vaccine. From day one, governments have rallied together to bring vast amounts of money to pay for the development of vaccines and therapeutics and diagnostics. They're spending unprecedented amounts of public financing for the development of these products, and these products therefore should also be public. If you look at the EU tracker for the pledged resources to address the COVID-19 outbreak, it now stands on 16 billion euros. That's an enormous amount of money, and much of that goes towards the development of new health products, and particularly to vaccines. That is, of course, let me be clear, the right thing to do. But this public financing should lead to innovations that are then also affordable and available. And we've heard political leaders, including Germany's Angela Merkel, refer to the need to develop global public goods. The vaccine should be a global public good. President Macron of France stated that no one can own the vaccine, with only a veiled reference to Jonas Salk's polio vaccine, of course, which indeed was and still is a people's vaccine. And this echoes the call for no monopoly on COVID-19 health technologies. Now, indeed, the intellectual property, as Moga already referred to, and the knowledge needed for this response that will be developed with this money needs to be available to all and be used for equitable access to new COVID-19 health technologies. And a people's vaccine requires that the intellectual property, the data, the know-how, the technology itself, the cell lines are transferred to help increase production capacity the globe over, to help bake this large pizza that Moga was talking about. But I share Moga's passion for cooking, so I love her food references, and I regret not having seen her lovely pizzas on the screen. Although it's lunchtime here, so maybe that would not have been such a good idea. But this sharing will not happen automatically, and this is why the WHO on June the 1st announced the establishment of a COVID-19 technology access pool known as CTAP. And CTAP is set up to gather the patents and all other forms of intellectual property, such as the know-how, the data, trade secrets, you name it, necessary to expand the development and production needed in the response to the pandemic. CTAP, a bit like the medicines patent pool, is a voluntary mechanism. And there, of course, also sits its weakness. There's currently no international instrument to force this kind of sharing of knowledge. Individual governments can use safeguards to do that. In patent law, individual governments can force the sharing of intellectual property, at least, but at the international level, that is not possible. Now, our attention should not only be on the vaccine. Assuring access to new treatments that are under development is also important, and we should not start thinking about that once those medicines come to market, as we've so foolishly did with the HIV medicines. There was no effort to make those available when they were still in early development or already on the market. Now, the success of CTAP will depend on the political support it will receive, and political support is needed. So far, 40 countries have endorsed the solidarity call to action that established the CTAP. But what would be important now is that the public money allocated for the development of these vaccines and other products come with strings attached, and in particular the requirement that recipients of public money share the knowledge they develop with the COVID-19 technology access pool, so that this public financing actually also leads to public access to the knowledge, the know-how that is developed with this public financing. What also needs to happen is for the WHO to be more forthright and proactively ask donors, ask countries that spend money and others to make this happen. At the moment, this is not the case. Despite lofty promises of the vaccine as a global public good, wealthy nations are not encouraging that those that receive the billions also share the results of their work with others. It's therefore understandable that developing countries are also looking at non-voluntary measures. In fact, high-income countries are doing the same. A number of high-income countries have sharpened the safeguards in their patent law to be able to intervene, to set patents aside if patents form a barrier to accessing technologies that they need. But on a global scale, India and South Africa a few days ago have sent a proposal to the World Trade Organization's TRIPS Council to adopt a temporary waiver from certain provisions of the TRIPS agreement, that is the international agreement that sets out the standards for the protection of intellectual property, to waive for certain provisions of the TRIPS agreement for the prevention, containment, and treatment of COVID-19. And next week, the TRIPS Council will discuss this proposal. Now, in the light of the lack of progress in voluntary mechanisms to share IP and know-how, this proposal certainly deserves support. It's an important signal that when it comes to developing products to combat the global COVID pandemic, it cannot be business as usual. And that may also require having to rewrite or set aside some of the rules that form constraints. Now, even if this proposal doesn't go anywhere, I should stress that not all is lost, because the TRIPS agreement actually has a provision, an article which is known as the security exception, Article 73, that may be invoked to override protections of intellectual property in case of this pandemic. So that is another venue to explore. But I should stress, and this is my last remark, Mr. Chair, that breaking the stronghold of intellectual property in the form of patents is only one of the measures that need to be taken, and it will not be enough, particularly not for vaccines and biologics, because what you also need, in addition to access to the patents, is the access to the knowledge, the data, the material, and the technology itself. So a proactive technology transfer, one of the things that were promised in the TRIPS agreement, needs to happen. And this is exactly what CTAP tries to achieve. But for that to deliver, political support is needed. And I can't stress that enough. Thank you. Over to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Ellen, for your opening remarks. And now we invite Professor Brooke Becker to give us his opening reflections.
So thanks so much, and I too appreciate this opportunity, especially to speak to civil society and civil society activists worldwide. We know that we all are in common cause right now. We're all uniting together to try to defeat this new scourge, a health scourge which was predictable but not prepared for, as we heard initially. And we've heard multiple accounts of business as usual. And what I'm going to try to do is to describe the dilemma we face in terms of the hidden prices of exclusivities. And I want to be a little bit clear about that. I'm also a law professor as well as an AIDS activist. So when we talk about exclusive rights, they're really the rights that are given by governments to commercial entities to have exclusive ownership rights and to exclude competition with respect to certain kinds of knowledge. So there's patents, exclusivities, there's trade secrets, there's other information and data secrets, there's copyrights. And it turns out that the technologies that we need to defeat COVID are many times covered by these kinds of, let's call them monopoly rights or exclusivities. And the presence of these exclusivities deform both the research enterprise and the access need. And I'm going to go through that very briefly to at least help people understand better why it is that so many people on this panel have focused on the need to overcome the monopolies and to put the private sector's interest in monopoly profits to the side and the public interest in equitable access and global solidarity to the front. So one question is, well, do we want closed science, the kind of business as usual silos and secrecies that we've had in the past, or would we be better served by collaborative and open science? There was an initial phase of collaboration between scientists in sharing the COVID genome and other early scientific knowledge, but that became compartmentalized once the knowledge showed commercial potential. Instead of open science with free sharing of knowledge, findings, data, and coordination between scientists, product developers sought to own particular pieces of the scientific enterprise. They returned to siloed secretive research, premature touting of preliminary findings, a Wild West race for first discovery, and eventually the enclosure of knowledge with patents, data exclusivities, trade secrets, and informational dark holes. Instead of the best science producing the best products at the quickest pace, we have suffered a race between separate entities that has not yet produced the best science. Okay, we have clinical trial chaos, literally thousands of clinical trials being organized right now, many of which are underpowered, whereas we could have had clinical trial coordination and comparative studies. But it's in the interest of the individual right holders to tout their product and to test their product against a placebo instead of comparative studies so that all the vaccines would essentially be, both trying to discover their safety and efficacy, but doing so at least in part in a comparative manner. So we could find the best vaccines, or probably more accurate, we could find the vaccines that were best suited for a particular population, because it may be that older folks like myself might need one particular vaccine and others might be something different. So the search for kind of, scientific reputation and commercial advantage, has put us in kind of behind the game where we should be in terms of having the kind of robust clinical trial evidence which will lead us to approving the very best products. Okay, what happened next? Well, we've had a rush to overly rapid approval of certain unproven technologies to treat and prevent COVID. We certainly saw that in the diagnostic space, but we see very troubling signs of a rush to premature approval of vaccines based in part by the congruence of interest between the vaccine owners and politicians who want to be seen as, bringing the products to market. And, I think most famously, unfortunately, we're seeing that in the US with President Trump. And so, there's a real rush to not the regular and very careful evaluation of safety and efficacy that we need, but a speed race for emergency use authorizations and listings, conditional approvals, and the like, without the kind of scientific rigor that we need. So what else? We've already heard about the fact that these exclusive rights result in high prices and limited supply. I think Moga and Ellen both described those eloquently, as did others. Whereas we could have had open licensing, full technology transfer, lower prices, and expanded supply. The packet thickets, data exclusivities, and trade secret protections enclose the COVID-19 innovation commons and lead to higher prices and false scarcity. Both major transnational biopharmaceutical companies and startups have raced to the patent office and locked up crucial know-how and biological resources in trade secret vaults. Having gained control of the geese that lay the golden eggs, the IP right holders thereafter enter into lucrative acquisition, manufacturing, and distribution agreements that maintain overly tight control over manufacturing and artificially limit supplies that could meet the needs of the entire global population. And of course, with their exclusive rights, they can also set high prices. We know that the price of remdesivir produced by Gilead can be as high as $3,120 for 6 doses. We know that a promising vaccine is being put on the market at a cost of $74 per double vaccination by Moderna. These prices are simply unaffordable for the world as a whole, even for rich countries, but they're certainly unaffordable for low and middle income countries when there's been severe fiscal restraints because of the economic recession caused by COVID. We have the companies, because of their exclusive rights, can control distribution instead of fair and equitable distribution to everyone in need. So this goes along with what Moga was saying previously about the vaccine nationalism we've seen. The nationalism works both because the rich countries have deep pockets and lots of money and political power to go into the office of a pharmaceutical executive and demand supplies, and will, as Ellen said, plop some money down the table to enter into agreements to support the research and development, to support clinical trials, and to have expand manufacturing capacity. But it's simultaneously hugely in the interest of the drug companies to charge higher prices and give preferential access to rich countries. It's a collusion of the interest of selfish, nationalistic governments, rich governments in particular, and of greedy, profit-seeking biopharmaceutical companies that allows this distribution to be skewed in the way it is. Instead of the people's vaccine, we have the US vaccine. Instead of the people's vaccine, we have the Pfizer vaccine. Pfizer doesn't actually, have its own vaccine, but just as an example. So, we have this situation where we have some initial scarcity, we have bidding wars, and we have, instead of global access, we have preferential supplies to certain populations in rich countries. It's just not good enough. So I think what we've tried to describe collectively in our presentations thus far, and I think we'll be very eager to hear questions from people who are listening in and from the moderator, is how are we going to get from this situation where we have allowed a profit-seeking, supply-limiting, preferential customer-serving industry? How are we going to defeat its control? How are we simultaneously going to defeat the selfish nationalism of certain rich countries that argue that the lives in their country are worth more than lives someplace else? How are we going to have the people's vaccine that we really need? And one of the things I really appreciated about Ellen, what Ellen presented to us, is she did give us some very concrete options that are on the table. And these are options that have to be taken up both by governments, acting in their own self-interest and in global solidarity. And more particularly, these are the kind of solutions that civil society activists need to take back from this conference to raise with their governments to force action to make the people's vaccine a reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Brook, for those views and challenging the world, particularly the policy leaders, private sector actors, to think of a vaccine that should be of a public good in nature, not a profit-oriented vaccine. Certainly, this is what we demand as humanity, that which is a people's vaccine. And welcome to those that have just joined us once again. Feel free to post your questions, comments, and reflections in the chat box. We will have an opportunity to dialogue and engage with our panel of esteemed thought leaders and activists as we progress with our conversation. But I would like to pose a few questions to the panelists in no preferred order. Whoever is feeling comfortable to pick the question may. I'm quite interested to hear more in terms of what needs to shift at a multilateral level for us to be able to realize a people's vaccine. We have been here before with other epidemics and pandemics, etc. We seem to be going back and falling back into the old ways of doing things. Of course, there's a bit of progress in terms of how now nations are coming together, or others led through the private sector alliances for the supply and distribution of the vaccine. So I'm quite interested to pick on you in terms of what is it that would need to shift for us to realize a people's vaccine at a multilateral level? And secondly, and perhaps I'm quite keen to hear from you, Kate, and maybe Professor Brooke, in terms of what are the lessons or learnings from other epidemics and pandemics, particularly around organizing society and organizing institutions, both in public and private sector actors, for us to be able to take this idea of a people's vaccine forward. And what is it that didn't work in the previous circumstances where the world or humanity faced a crisis of this nature or closer to this nature, that we may need to discard and not do with going forward? And of course, what commitments, in your view, will be needed from an international community such as G20 formations? And of course, there is G20 and other multilateral agencies such as BRICS, which of course, they are also all of them members of G20. And lastly, what conditions will be crucial for universal and free accessibility of the people's vaccine to succeed? Let me pause here for now with these questions. We will then open up the conversation with the participants. There are already a number of questions for us to reflect and hang here. Thank you.
Maybe just to start off with the question on what needs to happen at the multilateral level. I think first, countries, meaning governments, should take their responsibilities more seriously at the multilateral level. We often talk about the UN, the WHO, the World Bank, as if they are totally independent from governments and countries. These are intergovernmental organizations, and these are the same governments that are sitting in those bodies that have to take decisions, that have to provide funding or not to. I think staying true to their commitments to those organizations, to fund them, to also monitor what they're doing, and then to hold them accountable at the same time. This is the responsibility of governments that we are not seeing be played the way it should be. We're seeing certain institutions that are totally headphone at this time of a crisis. I think the Security Council, the UN Security Council, should take health security as one of the top priority on its agenda. So it's not only about sending troops or talking about conflicts, but talking about things that matter to people. And health security is a big threat, and it is a priority that also must be taken into account. We are seeing also there not a lot of change really happening in the way some of the multilateral organizations are doing business. So with the old tools, to come and then try to confront new problems, it doesn't work. What needs to be changed, in the World Bank? What needs to change in the IMF, in the international financial institutions at large, to make sure that resources are made, available, accessible in terms that can be afforded, by those countries in need in these current situations. And as we said, none of those will really happen if governments do not truly play their role and exercise, both their rights as well as their responsibilities in the multilateral institution. We're seeing a crisis, for example, in WHO. Some countries withdrawing, others, staying in the margin and then just crying wolf without really contributing the way they should be. Fully funding WHO is something that is really so obvious that it is a responsibility, but also to hold it accountable at the same time, because we cannot have it both ways and not, fulfilling our responsibilities and at the same time, wanting the organization to do everything if things are not, going right. And I think, finally, what we need also to come back to, and it has really to change in the international level and platform, we have to go back, to certain very simple thing. And I think it links very well to our title, People's Vaccine. The UN Charter did not say with the government. It did not say with the member states. It started with the people. And I think, if people and, government leaders are in those bodies, they need to put at the center what matters most. It is the people that we have to serve. And it will not again happen without active citizenship, an engaged citizenship and an activism. And that's why it is, I think, very important that we discuss these matters, not only in the formal settings, but also in organization or settings like the C20, where the civil society organizations and citizens at large have a very important role to play.
Thank you, Mr. Sai. Any other reflections? Professor Brook?
Why don't we let Moga go first? Her hand up was up first.
Go for it, Moga.
Okay, so I just want to give a couple of examples. So I totally agree with you. Governments should really hold the rein, and they're not. They seem to be happy to leave the market to deal with things. So just to give an example, when developing countries work together, this is governments of developing countries, when they club together and pushed for things, they pushed even during with all its problems, during the negotiation of the TRIPS agreement, they pushed for the TRIPS flexibilities. In 2001, we got the Doha Declaration. These things, they're not ideal, but they are much better than what we had before. Currently, there's negotiation at the TRIPS Council about waiving like intellectual property at the time of pandemic. And this comes from developing countries' governments, all these things. So they can actually push for positive change. They can use their power in terms of number, in terms of the population that they represent, and push for change. So that's the first thing. They have to take that lead. The second thing, for the rich countries, I remember the days, Ellen, you would remember that, the days when we were negotiating the medicine patent pool, where everybody was against it. Rich countries, pharmaceutical companies, of course, and intellectual property is not the issue and all that. And it was the pressure from civil society on the UK that actually changed the position of the UK and made them take the lead on supporting the establishment of the medicine patent pool. With other factors, they were not the only thing. But they took a lead. They did something good, and we have to say that they did something good. So there are examples of where these governments can make a difference and not leave our health basically in the hands of the market, because the market is not going to deliver.
Thank you that for challenging us. Thank you, Dr. Any other reflections from the panel?
So I'll just jump in real quick. I do think we have to think big. This crisis is big, and business as usual has produced and continued the crisis as it is. In other words, if we keep the status quo, we're going to have exactly what we have now, which is huge portions of the population underserved, sick and dying, and a few rich people in some rich countries being better off. You know, why does President Trump walk out of the hospital earlier than expected? He had 11 doctors. He had access to every therapy that was available. Who has that in South Africa, right? Who has that in Saudi Arabia? Who has that in Lesotho? So, I mean, the issue is we need to think big. We need to not assume that all we can do is tinker around the edges. So that partially means we have to reject the market-based solutions that have been presented. And I think we should call out the Gates Foundation in this regard. The Gates Foundation significantly pushes market-based solutions, tinkering at the edges, advanced market commitments, some commitment to tiered pricing for some portions of the low and middle income countries, and hope it works, okay? And it works at the margins. It works slowly. It works incompletely. It does not deliver what is needed. It's not big enough. It's not thinking broadly enough. We need we need countries to back South Africa and India. The biggest proposal on the table right now is get rid of intellectual property protections for this present crisis. Just eliminate them so that we can get every supplier in the world who's capable to be making the technologies we need to overcome this global pandemic, which is destroying lives, societies, and economies. And we also need, as a backup as well, to actually get companies and countries to push for intellectual properties in the COVID technology access pool. Jump in the pool, put the technologies in so the generic equivalent producers can make them. I just also wanted, because you asked me, some of us directly about, what could we learn about civil society activism from the past? Well, we know that we probably still wouldn't have 20 million people on HIV medicines in sub-Saharan Africa if it hadn't been for activism. The governments weren't acting. The drug companies were not making the medicines affordable or available. It was activists coming together globally that forced that change. And that's why it's so important to be on this call with fellow civil society activists from around the world. We need to mobilize. We need to form coalitions. We need to make demands. The demands are on governments, but they're also demands on companies. People will remember the chants that were shouted in Durban in 2000, where pills cost penny, greeds cost lives. That was a chant that people were saying in English and in Zulu at that march in Durban, 20 years ago. And we need to emphasize the importance of global solidarity, the push to individualism, the push to nationalism, the selfish reliance on, me first, just isn't good enough. It can't work. But more importantly, we are brothers and sisters. We are in this together. Our children are in this together. One other thing we learned, I think, and it's kind of a lesson about not going quite far enough. I mean, we won a lot of victories in the AIDS movement in terms of access to medicines and access to funding. And that's why we have, such a much bigger response now than we had 20 years ago. But we also had a form of AIDS exceptionalism. We're going to deal with AIDS medicine separately. We're going to treat Africa separately, but we didn't come to a fundamental reorientation of what medicines are all about. They are, as others have said, global public goods. They are what we need for health and for health security. To leave them in the hands of private interests who are trying to maximize profit just makes no sense whatsoever. It's a folly to continue this business as usual.
If I may just quickly add to that, and this is related to your question, what needs to happen at the multilateral level, and that is we really need to move away from this charity model of dealing with it to a solidarity model. Because what in the beginning, it seemed a little bit as if the solidarity would kick in. There was a lot of, that word was used left and right. You heard it nonstop. But when you now hear the proposals that come out of the multilateral system, or it's not it's the shadow multilateral system, the COVAXs of this world. It is the charity model. It is yes, we're going to pretend we're all going to together buy vaccines, but not really, because we do our own deals, and then we'll give you instead money, and then you can do something with the money and buy something for the poor countries. We've heard Bill Gates address the UN side event. I almost fell off my chair, where he promised, he had made a deal with drug companies, and he promised tiered pricing and donations. Now, I thought we buried that zombie policy 20 years ago, and here it is back in full bloom in the middle of the world's worst health crisis. That really needs to stop, and I think we need to be more vocal, and we need to make demands, because as Brooke said, activism works, and we need to be we need to be more vocal and make demands on our governments and on our multilateral institutions in a very difficult time, and in a time where the multilateral system is under constant attack. But that is where the solidarity sort of will have to happen.
Thank you for those insights. Certainly, indeed, it is about people's power. It's a people's vaccine, and of course, solidarity is quite key. We would perhaps now open the conversation to engagement with the participants. There already are a few questions and comments that have been posted for the panelists to reflect upon. I think one of the questions has already been kind of been posted through the chat box. So perhaps just to open the floor to engagement with the other participants, the floor is open. Whilst we wait for more questions, perhaps I can read a few questions that have come. One was, what can ordinary citizens do to help make a people's vaccine possible? And what are some of the legal options to push things in the right direction, especially on the IPs, TRIPS waiver, particularly drawing lessons from what Professor Brooke has spoken about, which is the initiative that South Africa and India has taken. It's a good start, and I think it's possible to get over the line. So what should formations such as civil society do at this stage to contribute to the process? And of course, imagining that we are in a dialogue with the G20 leaders, some of the most powerful people on earth, who unfortunately are seemingly some of the most selfish people on earth, thinking about their own individuals and their own, perhaps, countries' nationalistic approach to this crisis. What would be that punchy message, a call, a demand that you would put to the world leaders? So let me perhaps pose those two questions whilst we check other questions that are coming. And perhaps, Kate, would you want to come in? I see Dr. Mocha is raising her hand. Kate, would you want to?
Yeah, just the first part of that question in terms of how do individuals get involved and how do we make a difference. I understand it feels, particularly in this pandemic, people feel quite isolated. I mean, I think those of us that work in global health have never been more busy in our entire lives. And yet there's still this isolation because we're working for the most part individually. But there are plenty of tools still at our disposal in this virtual world to get engaged. I mean, I would be remiss if I didn't start by saying, of course, anywhere where there's an election as constituents, you have to vote, right? Sitting here in the United States of America. So you have to first rock your rights to vote and get involved in electing your individuals and then holding them to account right now. I just think of, and other panelists said this before, I just think of the beginning of this pandemic. I think of the launch of the ACT Accelerator and all of those heads of state. We've never seen it. It was almost like a windfall, standing up there and saying the medical tools that are developed to respond to this pandemic will be accessible to all. It will be, I mean, they use that language. It will be a people's vaccine. This will be a global public good. It feels to be honest, a bit disappointing that we have sort of wheeled back on some of that language as this flurry of individual nationalism and bilateral deals came. And now governments, high-income country governments, are speaking out of one side of their mouth that they're part of a global solution and finding ways to manipulate global mechanisms so that they can appear that they're participating in them in goodwill, such as the COVAX facility, while in the meantime, securing enough doses for 5 doses per person in countries, for example, like the UK, speaking out of two sides of their mouth, truly. So there has been some disappointment, and I think people are noticing it, and people are getting angry. They're getting angry, and they're getting motivated. We have not seen enough activism targeted at pharmaceutical corporations yet. I mean, how have they so far sort of gotten out of this, public outrage that we feel right now in terms of what's being set up to make these future tools accessible to all? So pharmaceutical companies are due their case right now for us to point out at them how much responsibility falls on their shoulders at the moment. So what do individuals do? I mean, they get engaged in these civil society platforms right now. There are a number of platforms that have risen amongst many of us here are participating in civil society. Reach out to the organizers of organizations like Health Gap, like MSF, like IFRC, Red Cross, Red Crescent, and your local civil society organizations to be tapped into the global community so that we can do this virtual activism as well to demand, change of pharmaceutical companies and change of governments themselves. So I know it feels very isolated right now, but there's still plenty of tools for the activist community to make some change.
And very practical ask is particularly for those organizations and individuals that are in countries that spend money on the research and development that invest in the vaccine today. And whose leaders often use this language, as Kate also referred to, this will be the global good and the people's vaccine. Ask them directly, what are you actually doing to make sure that this indeed becomes a people's vaccine, that this becomes a global public good? What are your conditions? I think another very important demand is a demand for greater transparency. So much today is taking place in secrecy. In my country, the Netherlands, the advanced purchase agreements have been declared state secrets. We can't even know the terms and conditions of them. Now, there needs to be a people's revolt against that. This isn't only for public health important, it's also important for good governance. How are we in a democracy going to hold our politicians accountable for what they have achieved if we can't even read what they have achieved? So those are very concrete demands to make and find ways to join the movement towards the people's vaccines. There are chapters in various countries. You can probably link up internationally. So there are many different ways to get involved, but put the ask directly to your political leaders.
If I could just ask that, to make it a little even more specific, because I agree that we need to go from the kind of anger at the way the world is, I think, which Kate helped remind us of, and kind of the focus on government that Ellen reminded us of, but actually the very specific demands that could be made to the government at this point in time. South Africa and India are standing on their own at this point. No one else, no other country has come to their defense. No other countries. There ought to be 70 countries that have already announced their support for what South Africa and India have done. And they won't do it unless you activists make demands and write to leaders and say, we need to support at the WTO this radical reformation of intellectual property hegemony that threatens the response to the COVID pandemic. And then secondly, changing the WTO rule is not going to be good enough. Every country will have to actually operationalize it locally. They will have to have their own local emergency rules overriding intellectual property protections, or using compulsory licenses, or developing their own national security waiver. These are all things that government's going to have to do domestically. So many times, and we see this in South Africa, unfortunately, sometimes. South Africa is doing wonderful things on the international stage, but for 9 years, there's been a campaign to change the patent law in South Africa. 9 long years. And South Africa still doesn't have a law that requires it to examine pharmaceutical patents. And it still grants more pharmaceutical patents than any country in the world. And so we need to tell governments, you need to do your work outside and you need to do your work inside.
Great. Dr. Moka, apologies.
Just call me Morgan. It's really strange to be called Dr. Morgan. Yeah. So just to add to this great idea that there is a responsibility within us as civil society to inform and to be informed. So those who know, like not everybody will know about the India-South Africa proposal in the TRIPS Council. Maybe some people don't know what the TRIPS Council is even. So there is a responsibility to inform people, and there is a responsibility to people who want to be active in the people's vaccine to be informed, to find out where to get this information. So it's both ways, so that we act as civil society, even as in activists, individual activists, we act on knowledge and we go for coalesce with others. So like the idea of the people's vaccines having what you call chapters or groups or whatever, and it's a loose coalition. You don't have to be a big organization or anything. Anybody can join the people's vaccine and share in the activities and be informed. And the other thing is that the people's vaccine is trying to do is to get, again, learning from the HIV movement, which was the most wonderful successful health movement that we ever had, I think, in my opinion. So what helped, and the one fundamental issue in the HIV movement was that people living with HIV are the ones who said, it's us, we want to live, thank you very much. So what the people's vaccine is doing is getting survivors, people who survived COVID, and carers, so people who lost somebody to COVID, to corona COVID. So these people have to really be allowed to be at the front of the argument and at the front of the debate and push. And you can push nationally, so inform the MPs, member of parliament, the media, that's at a national level, if we can do that collaborative at a national level, but then also be at the front and joining others to act internationally.
Thanks. Any other reflections before we move to the next slide?
Just to add that we may need an enabling environment also in societies, in communities and homes for that to happen. What we are seeing right now also is a level of stigma and level of discrimination also for even people who had COVID or families that were affected by that, which is also reminding us of what we have seen also in the HIV AIDS response and continue to see even today. I think the other thing is we shouldn't in the civil society world as well as in activism take things for granted. We in our midst talk a lot about TRIPS, so we talk about compulsory licensing, we talk about parallel importing, we talk about all of that. But this is almost a kind of an elitist kind of a conversation that we are having. So that needs to be democratized in a certain way that is also understood broadly, so that citizens also can embrace that. And finally, when we talk about government, again, of course, we think of the G20 government, we think of rich countries, and rightly so. But we mean really all government. And poor government should not be left off the hook, not to care for their citizens, not to invest, in primary health care, not to look at where their budgets are going. So accountability at all levels also is needed at a national level, so that they can also continue to play that role also at the international level within international institutions.
Thanks for that, Dr. Sai. A few more questions. We have around about 15 minutes, so we may start thinking about our closing remarks and reflections, thinking about what needs to happen, call for action, etc. But there's this specific question that is, what is the specific threshold needed to get India and South Africa deal over the line? Unanimous consent at the TRIPS Council, reference to the recent AU's joint communique was rather a bit ambitious on IPs. So I'll be surprised if SA wasn't really rallying support there as current AU chair. The TRIPS Council meeting aligns with the next European Council summit on 15 to 16 October. Are there any plans to do advocacy around this? And then perhaps one other question that I would like to pose is indeed maybe the right time to start thinking about the reform of WTO? Has the time not come? And of course, we do talk and reflect about the idea for transparency and accountability. How would it look like in real practical sense, in really lived realities, knowing very well that the multinational corporations, pharmaceutical, seem to be having a sway and a control over policy making? Of course, they're driven out of the interest to make profits. So what is it that would be required for institutions such as C20, G20, and ordinary people to really ensure that policy-making spaces, to use the word sanitize, are sanitized in a way to ensure that there is fairness and transparency in policy-making processes? And then, of course, we know that aid has been flowing, I mean, in reducing quite significantly at a global scale. And through, of course, the COVAX terms and conditions, we know very well that it is about also subject to funding availability. Moha has already alluded to that. Rich countries have already procured or made reservations for over 4 billion, if I'm not mistaken, worth of doses, and the agreements in the COVAX terms and conditions to an extent do permit them. So is that not really, to an extent, as much as it is a good attempt to fairly distribute, but it also further entrenches inequalities? Where do we start with achieving equality?
I'll do quick, but not take much time. So, the idea of WTO reform is a wonderful idea, but it's insufficient for the current crisis, right? It needs to be done, but we can't sit around waiting for that to happen. It's a consensus-based organization in terms of the overall, structure of how things are done. And we know rich countries, particularly the U.S., even though it's in some levels boycotting WTO now, is still strongly in support of the globalization of intellectual property rights. And so that, so yes, let's think about that, the even bigger change that you're just proposing. I think the proposal from South Africa and India is more tightly tied to this current pandemic. So probably that's the WTO action we should get behind now. And it could come to a vote at some point. It doesn't require absolute consensus. It has to be done within the larger WTO structure, not just the TRIPS Council. So, but yeah, it could happen and should be pushed for. I love one of the expressions in South Africa. You taught us all you didn't just talk about corporate power. You talked about state capture, right? You really described very beautifully the degree to which corporations have, in a sense, overtaken governments, and the associations and even foundations that support the intellectual property regime have kind of overtaken governments. And so I do think it's governments clawing back their prerogatives, governments joining together in joint cause to overcome corporate power is really, really crucial. The idea of creating policy spaces is too abstract in a way, right? Because it doesn't say, well, what are you going to do with the policy? But we know what the policies need to be done. It's not just creating policy space. It's using the power the governments have to require the reforms that are required. They have powers to control industry, to beat back on intellectual property protections. They grant exclusive rights. They can take them away. It's as simple as that. It's not such a big deal. So anyway, I think in some we need to be bolder. But we also need to think about what can be accomplished that will make a difference, now, not, in not then now. Okay.
Thanks, Dr. Brooke. Yes, state capture needs to be challenged and banished from policymaking spaces and from capturing the power of the people. Any other reflections as we conclude?
I think the point of leverage in this crisis is the vast public financing of the product development and vaccine development. Because this paradigm that we were made to believe in pre-COVID was that these corporations spent their own money and therefore they deserve all these protections because they would otherwise not invest in the development of these products. That's not what's happening today. But the outcome of the public financing may be the same unless we intervene. Now, these proposals from India and South Africa at the TRIPS Council are incredibly important. They need support, and that is something that I hope many of taking part in this meeting can contribute to. We also need to realize that the IP alone, freeing that up, will not be enough. We also need to look at the regulatory barriers, in particular in the area of biologics, which includes vaccines, where some reform is necessary. And I hope that the WHO is also working on that. And of course, the technology transfer, the transfer of the know-how, the materials and the technology. And that is what CTAP's key role is. So these things need to be linked. And that can be a very clear agenda, and these demands at the TRIPS Council will help to drive that further. We should also not forget that even if this proposal would fail, there is a lot that governments can do using the existing, either the existing security provisions in the TRIPS agreement itself, or as one of the listeners indicated, the measures that countries can take at the national level, such as compulsory licensing. But let's focus on the public financing and demand that public financing, the outcome of that becomes public and gets transformed into indeed the people's vaccine. I guess these were also my concluding remarks, so you can skip me in the next round.
Great, thanks, Dr. Elaine. Indeed, certainly, I think reflections and the discussions around whose role is it to finance distribution, research, and manufacturing of public goods such as this people's vaccine is a critical reflection, a point of reflection. And I think in as we close, perhaps also Dr. Sai, any reflections on whether the Africa continental procurement and distribution mechanisms and channels have really yielded any positive results in the distribution of PPE materials. And of course, to Dr. Professor Brooke and Mocha and Kate, any reflections or words, messages to the G20 leaders around what needs to happen now?
So basically what we're talking about is solidarity, not charity. And in fact, actually, it's short-sightedness from the countries that are hoarding the vaccine. It's short-sightedness. Even if the UK vaccinate half of the population, is the economy going to be back to normal? No. If the rest of the world is sick and not vaccinated and they're ill, our economy here is not going to work. And the same applies to the EU and the others. So even from a pure selfish point of view, it's in their self-interest that there is a fair distribution and a wider distribution. So like this increased production. So kind of like pushing for even rich countries, but also for Africans and others to support the CTAP really in a big way as a way to increase the supply. So we all get vaccinated, or we get, in slices. The other thing is about the short term and the long term. So looking at the WHO is a long term thing. For the short term now, we need to get the CTAP working. We need the TRIPS Council agreement to be supported by as many countries as possible. And as we all said, there are examples of when developing countries stuck together, they pushed for things. So they can get it, they can get the support within the WTO. There's some work going in the Human Rights Council, because at the end of the day, it's governments that are the duty bearer. Bill Gates and Pharma and COVAX and God knows who, they don't have rights. We don't have rights over them, if you like, except through our government. And therefore, who are they accountable to? There's an issue. I mean, Ellen said transparency, but who are these people accountable to?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Thank you.
I have to say that there are 92 countries in the COVAX facility. There are 92 countries that are part of this advanced market commitment. They're what Gavi is trying to fundraise for, to buy vaccines for these countries. This is going back to what Ellen and Moga had said in terms of this donor and dependent model and how we need to change the dynamics of that. Not only what Ellen said in terms of holding our governments that are putting all of our taxpayer dollars accountable for that work, and us demanding as the public that we get something for it. But these countries too, what people call the poorest countries of the world, also of course are contributing significant amounts in the global realm. I mean, they're contributing right now the big volumes that Gavi is trying to buy on their behalf. So these include countries like Egypt, Indonesia, the Philippines as well. They need to speak up too and not just be the recipients of these global models. So until we change that power dynamic, we're going to be just spinning our wheels and be back at the same place. So even if your government isn't giving a tremendous amount of money to R&D, your government also has a say in these important multilateral institutions and should use that voice to not just be the recipient and be told what they're being given, instead to push those power dynamics and make these things truly more equitable. So I would just say as well, to get involved in this, go to the peoplesvaccine.org, go to freethevaccine.org as well. We can continue these discussions there, and you can use your voice and your activism to make a change in that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Xaye. 30 seconds.
Yes, 30 seconds. I also hope that political leaders, champions in our industry, activists, we will all remind ourselves that we are also people, at the beginning and the end of the day. And that when we talk about people's vaccine, it's about also the same people. And the solidarity we are calling for, it's a movement of people who care, that will be moving away from the current denial that we see to acceptance, to this selfishness, to more solidarity and compassion and care and support. And that is really what is making true this kind of a motto that we are promoting, that none of us is safe until we all are. And I think that we will, and hope that we will keep that in mind, moving forward beyond the institutions and all the other bureaucracies within which we operate.
Thank you. Lastly, Dr. Brook, Professor Brook, 30 seconds.
No, I've spoken enough, but again, it's an honor to be on this panel with the people who are here, many of whom I've known for almost 20 years. So it's really. And also to our listeners who have listened in and stayed with us. We hope we've been clear, but if not, please feel free to contact us. I hope the organizers are making our email contact information available.
Thank you so much, fellow panelists and all the participants, to C20 for bringing us all together. Certainly, indeed, these are uncertain times. And of course, there are other global challenges that are ongoing, such as conflict, hunger, disease, etc. And this recovery phase would require all of us and our collective efforts. Indeed, all of us are exposed, our economies, people have lost livelihoods, their dignity impaired. Certainly, I agree with all the panelists that it is a time for solidarity and a time for people's vaccine and not for profit. Once again, thank you so much for your time and for your insights. Have a good afternoon or good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.